Jerry Griffin is the former director of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. During NASA's Apollo program, Jerry was a flight director in mission control for all of the Apollo manned missions. He was also lead flight director for 3 lunar landing missions, Apollo 12, 15, and 17, and led a team of flight controllers responsible for the safe return of the Apollo 13 astronauts. Jerry was a technical advisor for the movies Apollo 13, Contact, in which he also acted, and Deep Impact. Andy Aldrin is the son of famed Apollo 11 moonwalker Buzz Aldrin, and a leader in the aerospace industry focusing on the intersection of policy, business, and academia. He founded the International Space University Center for Space Entrepreneurship at Florida Tech, where he was also director of the Alden Space Institute. Andy's experience also includes leadership positions at Moon Express, an emerging new space company, Boeing, the Rand Corporation, and the Institute for Defense Analysis. Rod Pyle is an author, journalist, filmmaker, and editor-in-chief for Ad Astra magazine. He has written 15 books on space history, exploration, and development. Rod has also produced, directed, and written programming for History Channel's Modern Marvels, the History Channel documentary Beyond the War of the Worlds, and numerous titles for Discovery Communications. He worked in visual effects on Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, as well as various TV pilots. Rod is regularly featured on national media as a space expert.
All right, thank you for that, Tony. That was a great build-up. I still don't know what I'm doing on stage with these guys, but I'll take it. So we were having breakfast this morning, which for me it was better than working on Star Trek, having a chance to spend time with these two gentlemen. And I don't know how many people watching this will remember that Clint Eastwood was once an actor before he was a director. But in Magnum Force, he quite famously said, "A man's got to know his limitations." And I realized I was having breakfast with two gentlemen that have no limitations, and it was truly amazing. So thank you both for coming. It's really great to have you here. So I'm going to start with a softball question. I want to talk a little bit about the new space age, or as I like to call it, Space 2.0, which I trademarked, by the way. What are we coming into here? We had a space age in the 1960s. That took us from our first orbital flights out to lunar landings and back, and beyond, with, I should say beyond with other missions in Earth orbit. What's different this time?
Well, I think probably the biggest difference is that when we started the American space program, it was a governmental operation, and we contracted with companies to build the hardware and software and that kind of thing. What we're seeing now is more of a partnership between government and the commercial sector, and I think it's a good thing. We've got. In fact, as early as 1985, I tried to talk, when I was director at the Johnson Space Center, I tried to talk some of the big companies into investing some of their own money rather than government money to move ahead. But the big companies just said it's too much risk, our shareholders wouldn't go for it, so it didn't happen. So it took a couple of guys with a lot of money, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, to come along and throw some of their personal wealth at this issue, and they've both created systems that I think will ultimately take over what we call LEO, low Earth orbit, transportation up of people and cargo and transportation down. And that leaves NASA to focus on deep space. I just read this morning that Artemis 1, which is the next, by the way, Artemis in Greek mythology is the twin sister of Apollo. So there is a connection between Apollo and Artemis here. Artemis 1 is going to roll out to the pad at Kennedy Space Center on the 17th of March for its what they call a wet dry rehearsal. It's a combination there. They'll do everything except launch. They'll tank it, they'll get it ready to go, and then they'll stop, look at everything, make sure it's okay, and then they will fire it up to go probably in April, unless they uncover something in this wet rehearsal that really gets it. So it's an unmanned flight, but it's going to go around the moon, and it'll be a big step for the NASA side of the house. So we've got this combination now of commercial guys that NASA's buying rides from them, just like they do on American Airlines. If they're sending somebody from Washington to California, they don't have to own their own airline. So same idea. So I really think we're gonna see the commercial sector take over pretty much the domain in civilian space flight. It's hard to say about the military, but for the human space flight element, I think you're going to see them operating in low Earth orbit, and we're going to see NASA focus on the deep space, Moon and Mars.
So let me alter the question a bit for you, Andy.
I already made up my answer for this one.
Well, it's the same question, but I just want to add, so the first space age came arguably to an end with the final lunar missions, and then became something else, it transmuted. Budgets declined, public support declined, certainly governmental support declined. So what's going to make a difference this time to keep this one from coming to an early conclusion?
Well, the biggest difference will be made by private sector investment. And private sector investment will come when there's a good business case. And so in a lot of cases, that's fairly obvious. I mean, we know that we can make money using satellites for communications. And we're going to find out whether you can do this with very large constellations. I mean, you realize we're talking about 50,000 satellites? 50,000 satellites being orbited in the next 10 years for communication, and a cost of roughly-ish, call it $150 billion. That's a lot of money. And it's not a done deal that's going to be a profitable venture. So that will change things considerably. But I do want to go back to a couple of points of the previous question, because I think one of the first things you have to understand is what hasn't changed. Because Jerry's right, the commercialization is important. And it could, and I think will change a lot of things. But what it hasn't changed are some of the fundamental things that we do that we think are new now, and the technologies haven't changed that much. So things like space tourism, we thought about that, making the shuttle a tourism thing. We're talking about manufacturing in space. I'm sure Max Faget was a very good friend of yours, and Max Faget designed the industrial space facility, which was going to be a factory in space. So we did a lot of these things before. What has changed isn't so much that people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos are building new rockets with new technology. Even reusability doesn't involve fundamental changes in the rockets. It's fundamentally different ways of doing business that matter. And so they're revolutionizing the business side of space, the operational side of space, and that's huge. The other thing that I think is even cooler is what I call the democratization of space. So when I was growing up, when Jerry was in charge of space, you know, it cost tens of millions of dollars to build the cheapest satellite, and lots of tens of millions of dollars to put it into space. Do you realize that today there are kids in middle school building satellites and launching them into space? The number of countries that have space programs has doubled in the last 5 years. Mm-hmm. And so this process of democratization means that kids today in particular aren't just going to be observers of space. They're going to be participants. And that's going to change everything in ways that we just don't know. And that's the coolest thing, I think.
That's a good, cool thing. So, and thank you, because you kind of gave me a segue to the next question, which is a question that comes broadly from public and government, but primarily from the public, and has been with us since the 1950s, is why we're doing this. And it keeps coming around. It's interesting because if you read public polls from the 1960s forward, the public support for space remains roughly the same. It's about 50-50. But what changes is how the questions are asked, how the questions are tallied, and what kind of things you support. So if you say very broadly to the person on the street, do you support NASA? You bet. Do you support space flight? Yeah, I think so. Do you support going back to the moon with human beings? And that can drop as low as 16, 17%. So it's a little hard to figure out what that sweet spot is and what people are thinking and feeling. So from both of you, I'd be interested to hear why you feel this is not just important, but perhaps urgent, that we step up our efforts to put human beings in space in a meaningful way.
You want to go first this time?
Yeah,
Up
thanks.
to you.
Thanks, Jerry.
I got my answer already.
Then you go.
No.
I got to figure mine out.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No. Well, this is fairly philosophical, but I think there is a reason to go to the moon for a number of things. There may be something there that business case can be made. I know I've heard you speak about it, but there's a bigger, if you take a step back, I think, and this is a little controversial, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. I think within some undefined time, maybe 1,000 years, maybe 10,000 years, that we're going to have to get off this planet if the human species is to survive. Now, if you're not interested in that, the rest of my position here won't make any sense. And so I really believe what we need to do is start now and plan to learn how to move around in deep space. And I mean, when I say move around, I mean fly around, land, do things, decide whether someplace might be habitable for the human species, and if it is, obviously go back. But I think ultimately, and it may be 50,000 years from now, what we did in the Apollo era, which I put Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo all together, was a little tiny baby step. And what we're going to do with Artemis is adding about that much again. It's not very much toward that goal of being able to learn how to move around in deep space. So that's more of a philosophical goal. I do think that, particularly at the moon, and Andy's more expert on this than I am, I think there's some potential for business cases to be made to do business. So to do that, you've got to have sustainability. You got to be able to stay there. Habitats or, the Antarctica model or something like that, where you can actually have some time and not just getting out in a spacesuit and walking around and picking up samples, which is good science, but it's not proving its use.
So I love the vision, Jerry, and I agree with you. At some point, we must, as a species, learn how to do that. And I'm thinking in a little bit more terms of how to connect the dots to get there. And so I don't know if it was Arthur C. Clarke or Robert Heinlein. Rod, maybe you can help me with this, because it's a quote that's stuck in my mind. I just don't know who I'm stealing it from, which is that the Cold War created an artificial salient for human spaceflight. There was a compelling reason to go into space because we wanted to beat the Soviets. And that was great. And we're still kind of riding on that a little bit. The question that he poses is, when will humanity be able to fill that artificial salient with real sustainable activity? And so in my mind, the most sustainable activity, we will go to the moon and we will stay on the moon when it is economically self-sustaining. And there are ways of doing that by using resources on the moon, primarily to support other activities in space. But when we can do something like that, which people will buy rocket fuel, you can get rocket fuel on the moon, to revolutionize how we do space transportation between Earth and Moon. And I think at that point, it becomes self-sustaining. And at that point, we've filled the artificial salient. And at that point, we built the foundation that you need for the next 50,000 years.
So,
Can I add one point?
yeah, I just want to clarify one thing. You're talking about, when you say rocket fuel on the moon, you're talking about the vast water reserves.
Right, water is
into something useful.
hydrogen and oxygen,
Right.
which is rocket fuel.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point too. There is another more philosophical, but I think real in this case, and that's what space technology, and you're in the middle of it, does for young people, and what it teaches them and how it turns them on, and they're very good at it. I get questions sometimes from 8-year-olds and some of these things that just astound me. How did that little guy know that? So it's spurring them on to aim more at STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Now they're adding art to that, I guess, too. But my point is, it is an endeavor that I think captures young people. And that in and of itself has got a value. Now, it's hard to say how much and when, but we know it does.
I'll tell you what the value is. How much do you value your kids in the future of our country and of the world? That's the value.
Yeah.
Kids get excited by two things: dinosaurs and space. And they get over dinosaurs. They don't get over space. And so this is, I talked about the democratization of space, but the fact that we can bring space into the classroom in a very, very real and participatory way is a big change. And this is something, one of the questions of what's the value of space has to be education. We end up in the aerospace community talking a lot to ourselves instead of to people like you about what the value of space is. But if we can bring space to education in very meaningful ways, the kind of ways Jerry's talking about, that's huge.
And those are both good answers, and they're both kind of hard to quantify, and that's been one of the challenges, I think, in particular of NASA's messaging over the years. I mean, I work at JPL off and on under contract, and they talk a lot about just going back to what you were saying about that femur moment on Mars, when you find that Tyrannosaurus femur sticking out of the sand. Man, the budget for the space program just goes through the roof, and life is good. But that's probably not going to happen, at least not for a while. So we have discussed in the press in the past about the many benefits coming to the space program: technology, education. NASA was at one point giving more money to higher education than the Department of Education was back in years past. So there's all kinds of great benefits of this, and we'd like to see that again, and we'd like to see it move forward. What we also know is that the United States seems to, and this is arguable, seems to move fastest and perhaps accomplish best in a couple of states of being. One is during wartime. We've seen that many times, including World War II. And another is when we're challenged by a competitor. We seem to like competition. So in the Cold War, we had the Soviet Union was our prime competitor. Now we're faced with a new situation, which is, in some quarters, there's a feeling that we're having a competition in space with China. So I guess I have a twofold question. One is, are we in a new space race with Asia? And two, through that, on the other side, do you see a world where we have true international competition moving outward and beyond the benefit
True
of everybody?
international competition or cooperation?
Cooperation, excuse me.
Good. Okay, I'll take that one.
Okay.
So we are in a competition with China. I don't know that it's a race. I mean, because we've been to the moon, and they may get there. They'll get there well after we get back there again. Nevertheless, we are in a strategic competition with China across a broad range of horizons, and space is probably not the most important of those. However, there's a very interesting aspect to that competition that's going to take place on the moon, because there are, without getting into the details, the vast majority of the moon is kind of, I'll say, economically uninteresting. There are some special places on the poles that are very, very interesting. And I think we are headed in a direction over the next 20 years or so to have a competition to, you can't own the moon by treaty, but you can occupy it. And we will have a competition with China over occupying spots on the moon. That competition is very, very unlikely to get violent in any way. Nevertheless, it's going to be a competition. And if I'm correct about the potential for economic self-sustainability of the moon, then it's an important competition because it will actually control a lot of what's going to be important in space, which is going to be rocket fuels and materials on the moon. So that's kind of the way I see it rolling out. Can that lead to cooperation? Absolutely, but the cooperation will probably be more sustainable if that's cooperation along the lines of joint ventures and business. Because we will stay, as I mentioned, we will stay on the moon when it's economically self-sustaining and we can make money doing that. We will cooperate with each other when we can make money by working together. And so I mean, it sounds like a little bit of a capitalist vision, and I'm certainly not a libertarian by any stretch of the imagination, but that's kind of one of the ways I see things potentially rolling out.
Yeah, I can't add a lot to that. I do think I would emphasize that I really think this country, our country, does best when it's got a threat, economic threat, physical threat, whatever. The country seems to pull together. And I think Andy is exactly right. I think we can take this competition and make it a partnership, and probably, and by the way, that's probably true going to Mars as well, traveling on deeper into space past the moon. Or we can go it alone, which is going to be very hard and very expensive. So I think the country will respond to an economic threat, and I think if we can really find value at the moon, it'll be a good competition. I haven't been to China. I know some people have. I think you did some time ago. But Charlie Duke, the Apollo 16 astronaut, was one of the few people who have been, I know, in the last 5 years. He was very impressed with what he found there. Very capable engineers, people, manufacturing facilities. It was better than he thought it would be. Let me say it that way. But I think they're going to be a competitor in space and elsewhere.
So you touched on Mars, and I think we've only touched on it slightly, but there's a really good business case to be built for the moon for a lot of reasons, but especially because of the water reserves there. Now, Mars has plenty of water, probably enough to cover the whole planet if you melted all the ice to a depth of 100 feet or more. But is there a compelling reason beyond just the exploration initiative and the philosophical reasons to go to Mars? And if so, how do we do it in a sustainable fashion?
Well, I don't think we know. We haven't been there with the right kind of tools and people and so forth to really find out what is there and what could be done. Again, though, I think it's a very important step. It's a friendly enough place that we can get to. And that thing I was talking about earlier, where we've got to learn how to do this. It's never been done, moving around deep space with people. It's going to be hard, and it's going to be expensive. But I think that's more of a governmental role early, and then we'll have to, kind of like we understand the moon now pretty well, except for us for the backside. We don't know a lot about the backside. We've done a lot on the front. In the poles, we've got satellites that have done that. But I really think I think Mars is the next logical step, and that's in this process of getting deeper into space.
Jerry, I agree with you completely. There is no business case for going to Mars. However, there are compelling scientific and social reasons to go there. And I don't think, I mean, we talk about Mars being impossibly expensive, but we're spending $10 billion a year almost half of the NASA budget on human spaceflight if we simply focus that money and cooperate with other countries. You know, I think if you start talking about 15 or 20 billion dollars a year over 10, 15, or 20 years, we can talk about Mars. Now let's talk about why Mars. I've accepted the fact that I think we can afford to do this without fundamentally changing the NASA budget. Mars holds the key to 3 really existential questions, and I'm not saying it is absolutely will provide definitive evidence, but the first, the obvious one is there life in the universe? And so if we go to Mars and find clear signs of life in the past, even present would be really kind of interesting, maybe a little spooky. But if we find something, then you have to look at the rest of the universe with all of these exoplanets, planets we're seeing around other stars, and say, you know what, there's got to be other life in the universe. But if we go to Mars and we find nothing, in a place which look like the Earth, then you got to say, I don't know. You're not going to define it definitively, to repeat myself, but you're going to learn a lot about that question. Second question, 3 billion years ago, Mars looked like the Earth. And we kind of know why it doesn't look like the Earth right now, but it may tell you something about comparative planetology. That's okay, and that's probably the least interesting of them. The third thing, which is what Jerry is getting at, is can we learn to live on another planet? Because the moon is only 3 days away. That's not a big deal. Mars is literally, you can only connect with Mars every 2 years, and just the shortest, well, I'll say that you can do funny things, but when you go to Mars, you're going for 3 years. And that's a fundamentally different deal. And if we can figure out how to biologically sustain a presence on Mars, you know, over decades, then you gotta think, you know what? As a human race, maybe we can do what Jerry's talking about. So those are 3 really big things. And if we're gonna spend $10 billion a year on human spaceflight, that's a great way to spend it.
Now, when I was a young lad, which is not that different time when you were a young lad, but it was a while ago, we used to go out to the Saturday matinee and see science fiction movies about some kooky scientist or businessman, entrepreneur. Occasionally, it's some twisted military guy, but usually it was some lone operator who went out in his barn and built a rocket. I'm going to the moon. I'm going to Mars. And it always worked, and there was always a mechanic with a monkey and a big wrench in his pocket or something. But this idea of the solo operator putting the stuff together was very appealing. And then if you grew up during the space race, you thought, that could never happen. That could never happen. That's crazy. NASA has to do it. This is a government thing. Now we're in an era where if you look at the popular press and media, you're seeing a couple of solo operators that are kind of picking up the mantle. Now, admittedly, they benefited a lot from work that was done before by both the US and the Soviet Union, now Russia. But regardless of that, there is some money going into these programs, and they do, in a sense, have semi-private space programs allied and blended with the public space programs. Do you see any chance, I'm taking this question in a complete left turn now, do you see any chance that a private operator could get somewhere like Mars before government does, with human beings?
I don't think so. However, tell a short story. About 10 years ago, I met with Elon Musk, and so he had not had the success that SpaceX now has, launching commercial cargo and people now too. And I told him that it was a startup company I was working with. In fact, I was chairman of the board. It's now defunct. But we were going to try to go to the moon commercially. And we were going to try to use what they call the Falcon Heavy, what Elon Musk called it. We needed 2 launches. So I was just opening up discussions about buying those rockets. And his first thing he said almost right out of the box is, I'm not interested in going back to the moon. I want to go to Mars. Now, that's his, and that's the way I think Musk thinks. You know, you got to think big, and he may have to retract that some or pull back some, but that's what he wants to do. The problem is, it's going to be so expensive. Boy, he better sell a lot of Teslas to fund an effort like that. And governments probably can because they've got the resources to do it. So I think it could come later, but it won't come first. And I don't think the commercial people are going to beat them.
I just want to add how cool it is to be on stage with a guy that says, I was there to talk to Elon about buying a couple of rockets. That's not something you hear every day. Please.
I agree with Jerry completely, but when we talk about it taking a lot of resources, it's not just about money. It's about all of the knowledge that we've developed over the last 50 years about how to live and work and survive in space. And that's just really hard to bring together in one organization other than a government organization. And so I don't see it happening.
Okay. So as long as we're talking about Musk and Bezos and a new generation of spacefarers, let's talk about the newer generation. This is an increasingly exciting area for young people. And you touched on STEM and STEAM a little bit. When I was growing up, and I hate to keep taking it back to that, but when I was growing up and you were growing up, for most of us, you were either a scientist or an engineer, and if you want to work for NASA, and if not, you're going to work in defense or aerospace. And that was kind of it. Now there's a lot more opportunities, there's a lot more ways in. It's much more diversified in terms of ethnicity and culture and everything else. And I would like to get a message from both of you to younger people about why this is a good investment of their time now, because we really need more people moving into these fields than ever before.
Well, I think most of the young people kind of know it now. They and there are more fields. There were no, when we were flying Apollo, there were no fields in computer technology or anything like that. And a lot of kids are getting in now because they do understand digital systems of one kind or another, including computers. And we didn't have anything like that. We essentially started with what they call analog, which is, steam dials and things like that. And valves that you had to turn. Well, a lot of that's automated now. So, but these kids get into it, and he's starting them really young, and they're good. They really are good at it. So I really think the resources, the human resource, is going to be much greater that could be applied to the space question and solutions. And I think the whole idea of getting these kids involved early. I live in a small Texas community. It's unincorporated, and even the high school there has a rocket program. And this is not simple rockets. It's not satellites, but they actually the winners go out to White Sands, and the Army helps them. They launch sounding rockets up very, very high sounding instruments up to 120,000 feet, something like that, in a booster that's just this big around. So you've got kids in small schools now learning rocket technology, and it's just amazing how good they are. So I really think we're going to be okay with the human resource. The money will, if we can keep it balanced, like Andy suggests, don't have these big spikes. NASA's never had a great big spike, so nothing's going to change. And then we got to work the partnerships.
So the most exciting part of space right now is really the commercial sector, specifically the entrepreneurial sector. And entrepreneurial companies, we all think about them succeeding because they've got superior technology, which isn't usually the case. I think one of the more important things is, why do companies fail? And they fail not because of their technology. They fail because they don't understand the market. They don't communicate their vision well, and they don't understand other people. I mean, I won't say rarely, most often it's for those reasons. And for those reasons, we need to attract a much more diverse group of people into space, diverse in lots of different ways, diverse in terms of education, ethnicity, and that's when we will start being successful, because the real action in space, the real economic action in space, isn't up there, it's down here. The real money is being made on the ground. So depending on how you slice it, we've got estimates of the space economy in $400 billion. Of that $400 billion, let's see what, 300 of it is made on the ground, is applications from space, is ground systems from space. It's only about 100, 125 that is, which is actually space hardware. And so the people, don't think about engineers just building satellites. Think about people on the ground who are figuring out what to do with that data from a bunch of different satellites and creating information products that solve problems down here. That's where the action is, and that's not just about engineering, it's about a broad education.
So when I was writing Space 2.0, a little plug for my book there, I was trying very hard to figure out, first of all, I capped it about 25 years out because I felt going much further than that wasn't very useful for what I was trying to do. And one of the conversations I was having with an awful lot of people was, what is this, let's just stick with the moon for now because we built a pretty good case during this talk for why we're going to be there and what we might do. What's that settlement going to look like? So we have the model of Antarctica, where we have a number of international bases, and then the U.S. base at the pole, and McMurdo, where a lot of them tend to come together and work and then go back to their individual habitats. But there are a lot of other models that have been considered. And there are a lot of concerns about governance, and there are a lot of concerns about how people are going to work together. And I think the way it's often referred to, at least in my circles, is this going to be the utopian future of Star Trek, or is it going to be more like The Expanse? So at the moon and beyond, if you wish, what do you think that kind of human activity is going to look like, sociologically, politically?
It's going to be very interesting.
That's for sure.
I think at the moon, I don't know, I guess maybe at Mars too, but at the moon, what's in my vision is some kind of inflatable habitats, and there may be several. You can get so much space with an inflatable that is very, it stands up to cosmic rays pretty well and all that. So I think it will be a settlement that will start with a single kind of thing, and then it'll, like you say, it'll grow. And if different countries evolve, they'll probably have their own habitat and then a central area of laboratories and things like that. But I think, and I've never been to Antarctica either, but I've just read about it. And the cooperation there, I think, is good. I think it'll be, you're not going to have people, shooting at each other or anything like that, for sure. And I would, if I was younger, because I won't last long enough to see this happen, but if it was there and I could go, I'd go and try to participate with it. And I think it'll be interesting, but it'll also be rewarding. And science first, and then perhaps the commercial following it. But we've still got a lot to learn about the moon, an awful lot to learn about Mars.
Well, he kind of touched on a good point, which is, or at least moved up against it. In Antarctica, there's kind of a common cause, which is it's really cold here, let's survive, right? Yeah. In the space station, there's even more common cause, which is there's a hard vacuum and a lot of other bad stuff just on the other side of that thin metal wall. Let's try to get along here. This is really your area of expertise. Yeah. What do you think?
I was going to go in a different direction with this.
Okay, well, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I think the model you might, there are lots of different models, but one you should add to your quiver of models is maybe the North Sea or the Gulf of Mexico. Because it may be, for the moon, it may be that what you'll see, initially at least, is outposts that are there dedicated to resource extraction. Now, the twist on it is, as a tourism destination, the moon is kind of the coolest place in the solar system. I don't know, I think so, because you literally could be at one spot almost. You'd have to move a little bit. But on one side of the ridge, you could be looking at Earth always in permanent sunlight. And if you walked over to the other side of the ridge in the crater, you would have an unobstructed view of a completely black sky. So the most brilliant sky that you would ever see. So, I mean, tourism will be a part of it for those folks that happen to have $100 million in their pocket, because I don't see that number going down very much. So I think, I mean, we don't know what's going to happen. I think the Amundsen Scott Station at the South Pole is kind of a really good model for Mars, because there it will be about science. There isn't, I mean, I can squint my eyes really, really hard and think of a business case on Mars where you're actually somehow managing resource extraction from the asteroid belt, but I don't, that's out there with your 50,000 year thing. But at any rate, yeah, those are the kind, I mean, I think thinking about those models is an important thing, though.
Okay, so the only Venn diagram I ever put in a book, because I don't like doing them, because that's for smarter people, is one about new space, and the three circles were NASA is kind of the leading space agency in the planet, international space agencies, and private enterprise, and the magic happening in the place where these three things overlap. So as our closing question, I'd like each of you to provide me with your best possible vision of how those things align, and of course the international conversation, particularly of interest at the moment because of the difficulties we're having with Russia. But we've got the Russia-China bloc as kind of part of that international discussion, and then the other two circles. How do you see this perhaps playing out to the best possible future in the next 5 to 10 years?
Okay. So I think the first thing is
Clean up.
It's not a static Venn diagram. It's a dynamic Venn diagram, and it depends on what you're doing. And so I think there are activities, there are scientific activities, deep space exploration, astrophysics, those kinds of things, which will never include the private sector other than simply as a participant executing contracts. And so those really kind of appear in the international and national components of the Venn diagram. I would like to see more and more activities in the commercial portion of it, because as I said, when you're making money doing something, it's self-sustaining. You don't have to rely on taxpayer budgets, but that's going to be a smaller subset of things. And then there are things which will exist only in individual national programs like national security. And so I think it kind of depends. The dynamic piece of it is, not surprisingly, I would like to see more of this moving into activities which are self-sustaining through private investment and private markets. But nothing will ever be completely private. There will always be some element of government support in almost anything that happens in space. But yeah, that's kind of the way I would go at it. So maybe Venn diagram isn't the right thing. You're right. You shouldn't be using Venn diagrams.
Because I don't know how to use them. Okay, so before we get your wrap up, Star Trek or The Expanse?
You know, I've never seen The Expanse, but Star Trek Generation 1 was philosophically transformational.
That's a good way to avoid the answer. Okay, Jerry.
You know, you talked about the three elements, and they all get wrapped together. During the Apollo, shortly after the Apollo program ended and had time to reflect, there were a number of us that said, you know, we were really a three-legged stool on Apollo. It was an American program, for one thing. I mean, that was government, NASA, the contractors that built the hardware and all that. And the third leg of the stool were the universities. Universities really, really made what I would call the necessary input that helped us. MIT, Caltech, all of the big schools, but a lot of little schools too. Ames, Iowa State, known for its aeronautical engineering program forever. They all contributed. So I think I can't answer the question exactly like you ask it, but I believe what we're headed for is the right direction. And we'll have to put mid-course corrections into it and change the trajectory of what we're trying to do. But I think we're okay. We're headed in the right direction. I was present. I didn't meet with Jeff Bezos, although I've met him once, but I was present at a press conference that he did in Colorado Springs at Space Foundation's annual meeting. And somebody asked him, how are you funding all this, this commercial thing? And he smiled and he said, well, I sell about $1 billion worth of Amazon stock every year and give it to the Blue Origin, to their company. He said, however, I've reminded all of the employees this is a for-profit business, but he hadn't gotten there yet. So the commercial sector they got their, headaches in front of them, and they're going to learn a lot in this next few years. I think in that 5-year time frame, we may see more come in, and we may see some that are there now drop out. And if we can keep the government side of it stable, that'll be okay.
I want to build on that point because it's important. I agree with you that actually right now the only business which is really profitable is communications. And I actually see, for a lot of kind of detailed business and economic reasons, we're probably going to see a pretty ugly shakeout in a lot of these businesses. So over the next 5 years, you may see times of trouble in commercial space, and you'll read about it, and you're starting to read about it now. But I actually believe the companies that come out of it are going to be a lot stronger, a lot more focused, and I think good things will happen. So I mean, overall, I completely agree with you that we're on the right track, and I also believe that the commercial market, the folks in that market, are going to learn a lot of really hard lessons over the next decade.
Well, if it doesn't work at this point, poor Mr. Bezos will only be able to continue doing what he's doing for about another 180 years.
Yeah.
So, what a shame. Gentlemen, thank you. Your answers were much better than the questions, and the sum total is the future is bright. And you were a big part of it, so I appreciate it. It was an honor sharing this time with you. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.
Jeff, and thank you, Tony, for putting this together.